Imagine it now. The year is 1374. The bells of St. Paul's drift faintly through a gray morning fog, and the Thames glistens dull and heavy beneath the mist. The air smells faintly of smoke, ale, and wet wood. Somewhere down Cheapside, a baker has just opened his shutters. Somewhere else, a fishmonger slaps the day's catch onto a wooden slab still slick with yesterday's scales. This is London, not the glittering city we know, but a breathing, grinding, groaning world of cobblestone streets and narrow alleys, of trades and tolls, of hunger and hope. And to live here, to truly make a living, was not merely to survive. It was to balance, precariously, on the edge of fortune and famine. You see, in medieval London, survival itself was an occupation. There were no safety nets, no insurance, no systems to soften the fall. A good harvest meant full bellies and steady work. A bad one could turn the city into a slow starvation, where even the rats grew thin and desperate. For the poor, and most were poor, every sunrise began with a question: what can I earn today? The city was a living labyrinth of labor. Carpenters shaped the bones of houses with wooden mallets that never seemed to stop ringing. Tanners worked by the river, boiling hides in vats of foul-smelling liquid until their hands turned brown with the stench. The bakers rose before dawn, sweating in the dim light of their ovens, kneading dough that would be eaten by people who'd never know their names. Even the smallest coin, a penny, could mean everything. A penny might buy a loaf of bread. A penny might mean warmth for one night. And yet, a penny was hard to earn. Apprentices worked for years without pay, learning a trade under the stern eyes of masters. Servants rose before the first light and slept beside the hearth if they were lucky, their hands roughened by endless work. Even the beggars, yes, even they, were governed by rules, some blind, some maimed, all part of the same desperate economy of survival. To live in London meant to work. To stop meant to fall behind, and to fall behind meant hunger. The city did not forgive idleness. But for all its hardship, London was alive with purpose. Every sound meant something. The hammering of metal from the blacksmith's yard, the ringing cries of merchants calling out hot pies, hot pies, the bleating of sheep being led toward Smithfield Market. Life moved with rhythm and repetition. People knew their place, their trade, their purpose, and though the work was brutal, there was a strange comfort in its constancy. The streets, though narrow, pulsed with commerce. Merchants sold wool to men from Flanders, spices to nobles who wanted to taste the world. Goldsmiths polished coins that would pass through countless hands before being lost to time. In every corner of London, from the markets of Eastcheap to the docks at Billingsgate, there was motion, slow, steady, endless motion. But beneath it all was fear, for one bad season could break even the strongest tradesman. A fire could erase a family's years of labor in a single night. A plague, and there had been plagues, could empty entire streets, leaving behind silence and the echo of prayers unanswered. People prayed often in those days, not out of ritual, but out of raw necessity. A candle burned in every chapel for the sick, the poor, the weary, for those whose work had taken everything from them but faith. And yet, in the midst of this struggle, there was something deeply human, a quiet kind of endurance. The people of medieval London were not driven by dreams of luxury. They were driven by hunger, by duty, by the promise of another sunrise. A wife boiling thin soup while her husband repaired boots by the fire. A child carrying bread through the streets, careful not to drop it. A young apprentice rubbing his sore hands and whispering to himself, "One day, I'll have my own shop." They didn't know comfort as we do. They knew the satisfaction of a day's wage, the relief of a warm loaf, the joy of surviving another week. And sometimes, on rare nights, they found something like happiness in the small things: a song sung in the tavern, laughter by candlelight, a brief moment when the world didn't feel so heavy. Because life in medieval London wasn't just hard, it was uncertain. And uncertainty makes every small victory sacred. So they endured, through sickness and frost, through wars they did not start and taxes they could barely pay. They endured, and as you drift through the streets of your imagination now, the soft crunch of straw underfoot, the gentle hum of a market waking up, the distant toll of a church bell marking the hour. You can almost feel it. That pulse, that quiet, stubborn rhythm that kept the city alive. For every breath taken in that gray, bustling world was an act of courage, and every life, no matter how humble, was part of a greater story. The story of a city learning, through hardship, how to survive, and maybe, if you listen closely, you can still hear them now. The bakers, the butchers, the tanners, the children, their footsteps fading into the centuries, whispering softly through the fog of time. We worked, we struggled, we lived. By the time the first light slipped between the crooked rooftops of medieval London, the city was already awake. It woke early and without gentleness. There were no alarms, only the creak of wagon wheels, the ring of hammers, and the voices of men who had long forgotten the sound of silence. London's rhythm was labor, every street a heartbeat, every trade a pulse. To make a living here meant to join the great chorus of work that never truly ceased. If you walked down Cheapside in the morning, you would smell the bakers before you saw them. Flour clung to the air like fog. The bakers' faces were pale, their arms strong from endless kneading. They began before dawn, sweating beside their brick ovens, shaping dough into the loaves that would feed half the city. For a baker, sleep was a luxury. Flour dusted their hair like snow, and burns painted their wrists. Yet, when a customer smiled or returned for another loaf, there was a small, wordless pride that made the fatigue worth bearing. Farther down, near the Thames, the tanners worked, the men who gave the city its leather and its stench. Their trade was harsh, the kind of labor that scarred both body and air. Animal hides soaked in vats of lime and urine until they softened enough to scrape. The smell clung to the workers' skin, to their homes, even to their children. People would wrinkle their noses when a tanner passed, but without them, there would be no belts, no boots, no armor. Their suffering became the comfort of others. Every trade, no matter how humble, was essential. The blacksmiths forged nails, hinges, and horseshoes, the constant clang of iron echoing like the city's heartbeat. The coopers made barrels for storing ale and wine. The cobblers mended worn shoes for pennies. The weavers, in dim rooms filled with the whisper of thread, wove fabric for nobles they would never meet. And then there were the apprentices, the young boys and sometimes girls bound by oath to a master craftsman. They swept the floors, fetched water, chopped wood, and learned slowly by watching. For 7 long years they worked for little more than food and shelter. Their youth traded for the hope of one day owning a trade of their own. Many never did, but they worked, because work was life. Not all trades were honest. Some skirted the line between need and deceit. There were the street sellers, women with baskets of apples that were not as fresh as they claimed, men selling watered-down ale, peddlers with charms guaranteed to heal any sickness. In a city of thousands, survival sometimes demanded a little theater. The merchants, however, lived by a different rhythm. They dealt in wool, the pride of England, and spices brought from distant shores. Their wealth was built on ships that crossed seas most Londoners would never see. They kept ledgers written in ink and ambition, and though their lives were far from easy, they had something the laborers did not: time to dream beyond the day's work. And yet, even they were bound by London's rules. Guilds governed every craft, powerful brotherhoods that guarded secrets, set prices, and controlled who could work where. To join one was both an honor and a prison. The guilds gave structure, but they also demanded loyalty. Step outside their laws, and you could lose everything: your license, your trade, your right to survive. Still, beneath the weight of toil, there were moments of life that shimmered through the soot. At midday, workers would rest along the river, eating bread and cheese beneath the gray sky. A boatman might hum an old song as he ferried people across the Thames. A group of washerwomen would laugh as they slapped linens against the stones, their laughter rising above the sound of the tide. And when the day ended, when the bells tolled vespers and smoke curled from chimneys, the city softened. The taverns filled with voices and warmth. Ale flowed freely, and for a few hours, the heaviness of survival lifted. Men spoke of wages, women of family, apprentices of hope. Someone might tell a story of distant lands, another might boast of a trade well made, and for a fleeting moment, London did not feel cruel. It felt alive, human, imperfect, enduring. But the night did not rest long. By dawn, the cycle began again. The bakers lit their ovens. The smiths struck their first sparks. The merchants unlocked their chests. The beggars returned to the streets, their hands outstretched in silent plea. Each person played their part in the great machinery of survival. The endless wheel that turned day into night, work into bread, and life into history. And though we often imagine medieval life as distant, it was not so different from ours in its rhythm. The tools were heavier, the air thicker, the hands rougher, but the desire was the same: to earn enough to live, to belong, to find a reason to wake again tomorrow. For in London, to work was not just to live, it was to endure, to labor through hunger, through exhaustion, through the indifference of fate, and still whisper to oneself, "Tomorrow, I will try again." And so they did. Generation after generation, Londoners bent their backs and hardened their hands. They built the very foundation of a city that would outlast them all. And if you listen softly, beyond the hum of modern life, you might still hear it. Somewhere deep beneath the streets, the rhythm of hammers, the creak of carts, the faint murmur of merchants. The heartbeat of a city that never stopped working. In the heart of medieval London, where the air was thick with smoke and the streets ran slick with filth, there lived a multitude of souls who owned almost nothing but their endurance. The poor were everywhere, sleeping in alleys, huddled beneath bridges, begging at the steps of churches, scraping for a crust of bread that might keep hunger away for another night. To be poor in London was not simply to lack wealth. It was to stand one step away from hunger, one illness away from death, and one mistake away from being forgotten. There were no safety nets, no shelters, no mercy written into law. Charity was a choice, not a duty. And though the church preached compassion, even holy words could not fill an empty stomach. The city, in all its bustling glory, ran on the backs of those who would never see its riches. Servants and maids worked from dawn until the last candle flickered out. Stable boys slept beside horses, covered in straw for warmth. Mothers begged while holding their infants close, whispering prayers to saints they barely remembered. Orphans wandered the lanes, their eyes hollow, their bellies swollen from hunger or sickness. And above them, in the high stone houses and merchant halls, life went on. The city's wealthy bought silk and wine, hosted feasts, and counted coins by candlelight. For them, London was a place of promise. For the poor, it was a battlefield of survival. But poverty was not the only shadow that haunted the streets. There was another, darker, quieter, and far more ruthless. It came without warning, carried by rats and silence. The people called it the pestilence, the Black Death, the plague. It began, as all calamities do, with whispers. A cough here, a fever there, a family gone overnight. Then, the bells began to toll, not for worship, but for death. Day after day, they rang, until the sound became part of the air itself. The city changed. Markets emptied. Doors were marked with crosses. Priests moved from house to house, muttering prayers over bodies wrapped in rags. Entire streets fell silent, the smell of death replacing the smell of bread and smoke. For those who made their living by work, the plague was both a terror and a curse wrapped in irony. When death swept through London, labor stopped. There were no customers, no wages, no buyers of bread or cloth. But when the dead were many, the living suddenly found themselves in strange demand. Gravediggers, corpse collectors, and healers made small fortunes, paid in coin that reeked of death. To make a living in those days often meant to risk one's life. A carpenter might build coffins until his hands blistered, only to die in one of his own. A nurse might tend to the sick until her own skin broke with the same black sores. The poor could not flee. They had nowhere to go. The city gates were guarded, and countryside villages feared them like walking ghosts. And yet, somehow, life did not end. When the plague passed, as all storms do, London crawled back to its feet. The survivors emerged like ghosts reborn, thinner, quieter, but alive. The fields beyond the city were empty, the workshops half-staffed. Suddenly, those who had survived found their labor worth more than before. For a brief moment in time, The poorest of London earned higher wages than they ever dreamed possible. It was as though death had reset the balance. But the wealthy soon moved to tighten their grip again. Laws were passed to freeze wages. The powerful declare that workers should not earn more than was proper. The same hands that had buried the dead were now told their sweat was worth less, and so, the wheel turned again. Labor, hunger, exhaustion, repeat. But if you looked closely, you could see something new in the eyes of the poor. A quiet defiance. A dim but growing understanding that survival was not merely endurance, it was rebellion. Through the cracks of hardship, small acts of courage bloomed. Mothers shared their last loaf with neighbors. Workers gathered in secret to complain, to plan, to dream of fairer days. The churchyards filled with not just the dead, but also with voices. The sound of people learning to speak their suffering aloud. Even the children of the poor carried stories on their backs. They learned to find laughter in the smallest things, the skipping of stones, the warmth of sunlight on cobblestones, the rare sweetness of a ripe apple found by chance. In their innocence, they held the fragile heartbeat of humanity. For what was London, if not the sum of its endurance? A city of smoke and bells, of hunger and prayer, of filth and faith. A place where life was short but vivid, where even misery had its rhythm. When night fell, and the streets dimmed to shadow, the poor would gather near the firelight of taverns they could not afford, listening to songs and stories that made them forget. For a few hours, laughter rose like incense above the sorrow. The sound of music mingled with the crackle of wood and the faint, eternal hum of the Thames. And in that sound, soft, human, unbreakable, was the truth of medieval London. It was not a city of kings or cathedrals, though both stood tall. It was a city of hands, hands that worked, hands that begged, hands that buried the dead and still reached for life. Those hands built the bridges, the walls, the markets, the very bones of the world we now walk upon. They lived through hunger, through plague, through despair, and somehow, they endured long enough to give birth to something greater, the unspoken will to survive, no matter the cost, because in the end, survival was the true trade of medieval London. Every laborer, every servant, every mother, every orphan was a craftsman of endurance, shaping not wood, or leather, or bread, but the very art of staying alive. And though the centuries have passed, and the streets are paved with light instead of mud, that art still lives within us. The same quiet strength, the same stubborn heartbeat, the same hope that says, tomorrow, we work again. When everything else failed in medieval London, when the work broke the body, when the plague hollowed the streets, when hunger gnawed quietly at the bones, there was one last thing the people clung to: faith. Faith was not a luxury, it was breath. It hung in the smoke that curled above every candlelit chapel. It echoed in the toll of every church bell that rolled over the Thames like waves of prayer. It was the fragile thread that tied life together when nothing else could. London was a city of believers, not because they had the time for deep theology, but because belief was all that made sense in a world so cruel. The cobbler who patched shoes he could never afford, the widow who begged outside St. Paul's for a crumb of mercy, the merchant praying over his cargo ships, all of them looked to heaven not for comfort, but for meaning. The church stood tall over every district, its spires piercing the gray sky, its bells calling people from their beds and their despair. On Sundays, no matter how poor or broken, the people came, dressed in whatever scraps they owned. They knelt on cold stone floors, their heads bowed, whispering confessions of fear and hope. The priest's words rolled through the air like music. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And though they did want food, shelter, warmth, rest, still, they believed, because faith, even when it faltered, gave them something that hunger could not take, the sense that they mattered in the eyes of something greater. When plagues came, faith trembled but did not die. When fire devoured homes, when floods swallowed streets, when children fell ill with no cure, still the people crossed themselves and whispered, "Thy will be done." For in those words, they found a strange power, not of control, but of surrender. If life was suffering, then suffering must have purpose. If hardship was endless, then endurance must be holy. And so, faith became the quiet backbone of the city, unseen but unbreakable. It was not only in churches that faith lived. It breathed in small acts, the baker giving an extra loaf to a starving child, the healer tending to the dying though she knew the sickness might take her too. It lived in lullabies sung by mothers to their children, songs that spoke of better days that never seemed to come but somehow always kept them alive. There was faith and friendship too, in the shared laughter between workers at dusk, in the passing of a flask, in the small joke told to lighten an impossible day. There was faith in the idea that tomorrow might be gentler, that labor might someday lead to peace. But London tested faith as much as it inspired it. There were fires that tore through neighborhoods, reducing years of labor to ash. The Great Fire of 1212, and later the one of 1666, though centuries apart, carried the same cruelty, bright and unmerciful. People ran carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs, their faces lit orange by flames that seemed to mock their efforts to build. And yet, each time, they rebuilt, brick by brick, beam by beam. They raised their homes again. The smell of smoke faded, but the courage did not. There was a strange rhythm to their endurance, as if destruction itself had become part of London's heartbeat, because that was what it meant to live there, to fall and to rise. Over and over again, the city was never kind, but it was alive, and to live within it was to inherit its stubbornness. The poor learned to make peace with uncertainty. The sick learned to pray even when healing never came. The laborers learned to find meaning not in reward, but in effort. To them, survival itself was sacred. When night fell, and the city dimmed into silence except for the flicker of torches and the murmur of the river, one could feel that strange blend of exhaustion and faith hanging in the air. Somewhere, a mother rocked her child to sleep beside an empty hearth. Somewhere, a mason counted his few coins and whispered thanks anyway. Somewhere, a widow looked at the stars and saw not distance, but promise. And in those moments, London was not just a city of hardship, it was a living prayer, a place built not only of wood and stone, but of faith turned into flesh, into labor, into breath. Even now, centuries later, when you walk through its streets, beneath the towers and the hum of modern life, there is still something ancient there. Beneath the concrete lies cobblestone. Beneath the noise, a heartbeat. The echo of those who once worked, suffered, prayed, and survived. They left behind no monuments, no great tombs, only the memory of endurance. It lives in the rhythm of the city itself. Every bell that rings, every bridge that arches across the Thames, every marketplace that still hums with trade, all of it is a whisper from the past. We endured, because that is what they did best. Through plague, fire, poverty, and hunger, they kept going. They built without hope of glory. They loved without promise of comfort. They prayed without proof of answer. And yet, somehow, it was enough. Their lives were short, but their courage was vast. Their dreams were small, but their spirit was immeasurable. And though history remembers kings and conquests, it was these nameless workers, mothers, and dreamers who truly kept the city alive. The story of medieval London is not the story of greatness. It is the story of grit, of hands that would not stop building, of hearts that would not stop believing, of faith that would not stop burning, even when the world around it turned to ash. So when we ask, how hard was it to make a living in medieval London? The answer is both simple and eternal. It was as hard as life itself. And yet, they lived with hunger, and still baked bread. They lived with sorrow, and still sang songs. They lived with loss, and still found love. They lived with nothing, and still gave what little they could. That is the truest miracle of their time, and perhaps of ours, that the spirit of endurance never dies, even now, centuries later. Beneath the roar of buses and the glow of street lamps, their spirit lingers in the stones and the air, a silent reminder that life, no matter how hard, no matter how cruel, is still worth living. And somewhere, beneath the city's noise, you can almost hear it, the faint, timeless whisper of those who came before. Keep going, work hard, believe still, because to live, even in the hardest of times, has always been the greatest act of faith.